I'm in the mood for love. Now, before you start to think that the preacher's gone crazy, some of you may recognize that's one of the oldies and goodies from way back when. Written in 1935, that song has been around for a long time, and it's been bouncing around in my head ever since I put together this message, because I'm in the mood for talking about love. I want to talk about what the Bible says about the love that Christians are to have for one another. And so it is, I have a song in my head and a dash of red, and I'm going to talk to you today about love. Our text is John chapter 13. It's verses 34 and 35, words you'll recognize. Jesus was speaking, and he said, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you. And it's by this that all men will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another." Jesus spoke those words at the Last Supper as he gathered there with his apostles around the table. He gave this new command to them, and not just for them. It was to be shared with their disciples and to be passed along even to us today. Now, I believe that this message, love one another, was appropriate then and is most appropriate in our present time. Because in times like these, we need to love one another. So let me take that passage and tell you a little bit more about this love that Jesus spoke of. First, he called it a new command. Now, when I look at it, I'm thinking, that actually sounds pretty old. If you go back to the Old Testament, doesn't it always talk about love as well? Now, there may be some of you who are thinking, no, there's a difference between Old Testament and New Testament. Old Testament was law and wrath and judgment, and it's New Testament that gives us love and mercy and grace. Now, while it's true that each Testament has its strong emphasis, still, you'll find in the New Testament, there's still a message about law and judgment and wrath. Likewise, in the Old Testament, you will find love, grace, and mercy. I remind you, for example, of what happened when Jesus confronted a man who put a question to him, what's the greatest commandment in the Old Testament? Jesus says, I'll give you the top two. First one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and strength. You remember number two, love your neighbor as yourself. And with that, he quoted from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. You see, the idea of loving beyond yourself, that wasn't a brand new idea. It was an old idea. Even Moses taught it. And yet, as I look closely at what Jesus said, I realize he took an old idea, and from it, he gave us a new idea. He transitioned from love your neighbor to love one another. There's a real difference there. In loving your neighbor, that can be one way. I will show love whether or not I receive any in return. But to love one another, that's going to be something that's mutual. It's reciprocal. It's a love that we share back and forth, and that's where Jesus says, I've got something new to give you. We're going to practice loving one another. Now, if you think about the people of God in the Old Testament days, a lot of their identity was found in their Jewish race and heritage. That brought them together as a people of God. Things changed, though, in the New Testament times, because being a Christian, being a part of the church, isn't so much about race and heritage and things like that. No. It's about this faith we share together in Jesus Christ and the bond of love that holds us together as a fellowship in Christ. I use that phrase, the bond of love, because that's the way Paul speaks in his epistles. Paul will, for example, in the book of Colossians, chapter 2, verse 2, Paul will say that you and I are knitted together in love. You know how knitting works. As you're weaving something together, and before you get done, it's together and it's tight. That's what you and I do. Our love back and forth towards one another, and we're knitted together in love. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 14, he'll tell us to practice love because it's the perfect bond of unity. And when I think of a bond, I imagine, for example, glue. And two things glued together, and now they're stuck, they're tight. Or, if you prefer, you can picture a bond as in a chain or a rope that's linking two wrists together, but now they are together. They're united as one. However you want to imagine it, Paul says it's love that has changed things. Because, you see, love is going to now take us from just simply putting it out there for somebody, but rather it's a sharing back and forth as we love one another. And so we're going to have a fellowship of mutual love if we're practicing what Jesus taught us when he said the new command is that you love one another. Now, he did put it in the form of a command. He said, this is a new commandment. And what that means is it's not optional. We got to do it. Fact is, he said it 3 times in that same context to make sure that you and I heard him. And so we need to approach this as something the church is supposed to do. It's expected. We're obligated. 60 years after Jesus said those words, the Apostle John was writing his first epistle. And John is reflecting back on those days with Jesus and on that Last Supper evening when he heard these words from Jesus. And John says in 1 John chapter 3, this is his commandment. His commandment is that we believe in the Son of God, Jesus Christ, but also that we love one another just as he commanded us to do. Yes, it is a command of Christ. But it's even more than that. It's an example of Christ. If I go back to my text, he says, I want you to love one another even as I have loved you. And Jesus set the standard of what this love one another would look like. If you think about it, those apostles would already resonate with this. 3.5 years earlier, he called them to be his disciples. They made it into the inner circle we call the apostles. And after 3.5 years together, they had experienced the love and friendship of Christ. They knew what he was talking about. Not only that, they witnessed him as he traveled from village to village and town to town. And they watched Jesus encounter people he had never met in his life. He didn't know them, but Jesus never met a stranger because he showed love and compassion and kindness to every person he met, including the most needy of all. You see, they knew what this would look like, love one another. They'd watched Jesus. And if they took a step back and just thought about it theologically, they will one day tell us the story of how the Son of God in heaven left his throne, came to earth in human form, and lived through the suffering and indignities of his life as a man, and went to the cross and died for our atonement, a self-sacrificing love for others. You see, Jesus taught them something new, a new idea on an old idea, but something we are expected to do because it imitates Jesus Christ. We are to love one another. Now, it's not only a new command, but as Jesus gives it, it will become a Christian distinctive. If I go back to my text, he says, it's by this that all men will know that you are my disciples, if they can see you loving one another. Our love for each other should be such a thing that people can see it and take note that we belong to Christ. Now, how's that going to work? Let me describe this Christian love to you as I understand it. First, Christian love is an active love. And by that I mean it actually does something and doesn't just talk about it. You know how that works. This is commonplace in life. People are real big on talking a good game. It's the few who follow through and actually make it happen. Now, when I think about the average person in this world, especially in our culture, most people are kind-hearted, sympathetic. You show them a needy case and their heart will break. And they'll say, somebody ought to do something. But you see, love that God has in mind isn't love that feels and thinks and talks, and that's all. It's a love that does. That's how John described it to us in the epistle of 1 John. John said, let's not just love with word and tongue, let's do it with action, with deed. And that's what Christian love would look like. It's Christians not just feeling it, saying it, but doing it. And it's in the doing it people get a chance to see it. And they'll know that we're his Christians because of our love. Christian love is an active love. It's also a consistent love. And when I say consistent, it's something we do all the time. Good times or bad, it doesn't matter. We're consistently practicing love for one another. Now here's why I want to reflect on what happens in our day and age when a crisis breaks out. You know how it works. When a crisis hits, then everybody thinks, let's do something. And before you know it, you've got a lot of people reaching out and helping. And that's whether they're church or not. They'll get out there and lend a helping hand. You've seen this in hurricane relief or with a tornado, an earthquake, or a flood. You put a crisis out there, and people all around are going to jump in and let's say, let's do something. Now, that's at the beginning when the crisis hits and it's on our mind. You also know what happens later. At some point, the interest fades. People go back to what they do. And you see, Christian love is a consistent love. It is to be expressed not only in the crisis moments, but even when there is no crisis and times are good and we're still looking for ways to express love to one another. Now, if we're going to express love in the good times, you know very well, we've also got to find a way to express it in the tough and challenging times, like we're living in today. Because that's what Christian love does. It's active and it's consistent. Christian love is also what I'll call regardless love. Now, perhaps you're thinking the grammar check on my computer should have caught that. It's an odd way of phrasing things. Actually, the way you're perhaps more used to hearing it is that love is unconditional. But I'm going to call it regardless love. Because Christian love is the kind that we're supposed to love one another in any time, regardless of the circumstances. At any time, we'll show love, and it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. I take you back to when Jesus said those words on that Thursday night before Good Friday when they're going to nail him to a cross. You see, in that context, he was setting up his disciples for what was coming. And what was coming was not only his death, but their deaths as well. He warned them in that upper room. He said, if they hate me, you know they're going to hate you, so get ready. And true to his words, the church began in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, and by Acts chapter 3, Peter and John were arrested. And it went on like that throughout the book of Acts. Throughout the rest of that first century and into the next 2 or 3 centuries, the church faced persecution. Now, a persecuted church has one thing on their mind, and that is this: self-preservation. How do we protect ourselves, our family? How do we keep our church alive? As you're thinking self-preservation, you got to take action, and they did. They would flee from their homes and their towns to find a safe place. They oftentimes would take their gatherings and break them down into little small cells, meeting in discrete locations so they could keep themselves safe. They had to do things different because of the crisis at hand, the persecution. Now, in those kind of situations, they didn't take love one another, that command of Jesus, and set it aside. We'll get back to that later. Oh, no. They continued to practice the love that Jesus said you need to be doing. It's a distinctive mark of the church. And so they did. Now, you can see this as you read the rest of the New Testament epistles, oftentimes written in times of persecution, but you'll watch the writer, whether it be a Paul or Peter or whoever it is, he'll speak to the churches and he'll commend them for their love of one another and then challenge them to keep on doing it. Don't stop, but keep doing it and let it grow. Yes, even in difficult times, the church had to learn, how do you practice love for one another? I want to give you a good example. It's the church of Thessalonica. Now, I picked them out because I believe they were one of Paul's favorites. He refers to them in 1 Thessalonians as a model church. Now, it wasn't a big church, small church in a small town. But Paul would point to the church of Thessalonica and say, that's what a church ought to look like. Now, I will tell you this. He had a tough time starting that church. You read Acts chapter 17, it was on his second missionary journey. And as he went there, he had the Jewish residents, which were in significant numbers. They opposed Paul from the very beginning, and they very quickly forced him to move on. He went down the road to Berea. But he did leave behind a little group of disciples, and they became the church of Thessalonica. And as Paul later tells the story in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, that little church, they did what a church is supposed to do. They practiced everything that Christ wanted them to do. And that little church was a model church for others to look at and learn from. Now, as Paul describes them, here's what Paul says. Paul says, everywhere I go, I boast about you. I brag about this little church of Thessalonica. And he mentions 3 things in particular that he likes to brag about: your faith, your perseverance, and your love. They had a strong faith commitment to Jesus Christ, and they were going to be the church even in a difficult circumstance, which led to their perseverance. They refused to give up being the church, even though they were surrounded by their own people, Paul says. It was their family and friends and neighbors trying to stop them, and they still refused to give up being the church of Jesus Christ. Your faith, your perseverance, but he also points out time and time again, and your love. You practice love for one another in such a way that really you're an example for the rest of the churches of what love looks like when it's practiced. Now, I like the church of Thessalonica for many reasons, but I like the idea that they could face the crisis of their day, and still they knew how to be the church, and they knew how to practice love for one another, because that's what the church does. The church has a regardless love, and any time we're still going to practice love regardless. It's not just any time, it's for anyone. We do love one another regardless of who you are. Of course, that's going to take us back to the teachings of Jesus. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, it's a good thing. Love your family. Love your friends. I want you to love your enemies as well. And he even pointed out, even those who persecute you, we still practice love. You see, that's who we are as we imitate Jesus Christ himself. We love one another. We love everyone, and it doesn't really matter who you are. It's a regardless kind of love. That's not always easy, is it? Because sometimes as the rest of Scriptures try to teach us about that, sometimes we balk. We'll be told, for example, that you don't give back what they gave you. It's not fire for fire. It's not evil for evil. No, you turn the other cheek. You speak a word of graciousness and kindness, even as they gave you something more hateful. It's not an easy thing to do. But we're always reminded in Scriptures, watch Jesus. Jesus did that. As Peter points out in his epistles, Jesus stood on trial and took all the abuse that came his way, and still he said not a word, nothing that was hateful or unkind. He just spoke the words that needed to be said. And that's what we are to do as well. We're to practice that kind of love. Because it is the kind of thing that is to be active, where people can see it, consistent. We're doing it all the time, good times and bad. As the kind of love we'll do it regardless of the circumstances or the people we encounter, because it is our Christian distinctive. It's how the world knows that we belong to Jesus Christ. Love one another is an abiding principle. It's something we're to always do. For 2,000 years we've been quoting that verse, and we've been trying to practice it as best we can, and it's going to continue on until the day we gather around the throne in heaven and have a loving fellowship with one another in that holy land. Now, until we get there, we've still got to find ways to practice love for one another today. Now, when I think about that, I realize I'm asking you to do something that's not exactly easy to do today. Not in our current situation. Because in our current situation, we can't even gather together in so many cases. How are we supposed to express love for one another? We can't even be near one another. How are we supposed to maintain this fellowship, a sense of a bond of unity and love when we are a scattered church? Yeah, it's going to be difficult. And so we've got the rules and the regulations, the advisories that tell us only so many can be together, and that number keeps getting less and less. Hard to practice fellowship and love. And social distancing, don't get me started on that, because we're all struggling to figure out how do we make that thing work. Because so many of you love to shake the hand, you love to give the big hugs, and some of you are dying. You're not sure exactly what to do. And I've had to adapt to it. When I encounter someone, I try to put my hands in the pocket first thing, lest I forget that I'm not supposed to be shaking your hand, and then I may have contaminated you or you contaminate me. No, we got to work on this, but while we're doing it, how do you do like Paul says, greet one another with a holy kiss, and I can't even get within 6 feet of you? Yeah, it's challenging times. And when we get the shelter in place commands, as so many locations are doing, now what do? Because when we get those kind of rules, that really restricts our comings and our goings and our times that we'll interact, even safely interact. What you could do, of course, is you could just take some of the practices of the church that are part of our usual and say, we'll just suspend those for now. We'll come back to them later. Let's not do that. What I want us to do is be creative, because challenging times force us to have to think creatively and see if we can find a way to still do what the church is supposed to do. And in this case, how do we love one another even when we are separated? I've got some suggestions for you. I want you to take them seriously. I want you to practice these and see if we can't maintain that bond of love, that fellowship that we have in Christ until the day we get to come back together as the body of Christ gathered for worship. Now, I'm going to start at the top with what I think is a biggie, and that is this. It's time to start making some phone calls. Now, I know the picture I'm showing you, some of you are wondering, so what is that contraption? How does it work? We've got our newer phones. We've got our smartphones now. And so if that's what you're using, that's fine. But it's time to take the phone in hand and start making some phone calls to your Christian brothers and sisters, to your church family. Now, if you're thinking, oh, no, that's not how we communicate today. Today we do messages and texts and this and that. I know. But I'm going to ask you to go retro, to go back old school. Because we got to do something about losing the personal touch. We can't shake hands. We can't hug. So I want you to try this. Let your voice be the personal touch. See, I think that's going to pay off. You call someone up from church and you talk to them. And you two interact by voice. I tell you, they're going to appreciate that. Now, if you're wondering, what am I supposed to say? I think you can figure this out, but you'll say such things as, how are you doing? How's your family? Everybody healthy? Everybody safe? You may ask, are there any news? Because we're not hearing a lot of news right now. Any prayer concerns? Because I'd like to pray for you. You see, you do those kind of things. Now, it's not so much about yourself. This isn't the opportunity for you to tell your story. You're calling them and sharing some love. And in the process, they'll want to know about you. Also, make sure that you end with some kind of word of encouragement. I miss you. Miss being together. Looking forward to getting back together. I hope it's soon. See, you don't have to make it difficult. You may say, that's a little awkward because you're talking about some people I've never, ever called by phone. We talk other ways. We talk at church. We do this. I know it may be awkward at first. You try it. Here's what you'll find, I believe, every single time. They're going to appreciate the fact that you took the time to call. I'm going to recommend you go highly with this phone call. Now, I'm going to give bonus points for anybody who does FaceTime and something along those lines, where you actually talk face-to-face. I'm not much into that, not sure about the technology, but if you can do it, give it a try. People will enjoy a little bit of fellowship, the sharing of love with one another. I'll give you a second thing I want you to do. Try some writing. And I mean the old-fashioned way. I want you to start doing something along the lines of cards or letters or notes and things of that sort. Once again, if you're thinking nobody does that anymore except you old people, listen, I want you to try it anyway. People still enjoy receiving something that comes in the mail that you've written on. People still get a kick out of that kind of thing. Now, as you do that kind of thing, you may say, yeah, but they're not going to want to receive from me in the mail because it might be contaminated with germs. That's true, it might. Just like everything else you're bringing in your house, your groceries, your this, your that. So here's what they can always do. They can take that letter you sent them and they can just set it aside and do a 3-day quarantine. Then they can open it. They'll look forward to it. They'll work it out. You take the step to do a loving act their direction. I'm encouraging you to write. Now, I'm not going to neglect the one that you want to do, so many of you, and that is messaging. Whether it be email or texting and all these other things that people do today that I can't even keep up with. If that's what you do, do that as well. But I'm going to suggest this to you. I'm going to suggest that when you do that, it's the follow-up to that phone call I emphasized. See, you start first with that personal touch of the voice. Having done that, now this is where messaging comes into play as something you can do that's for the quick follow-up, such as they mentioned in the phone call. Our daughter's going to be waiting on some results here next Tuesday. I'd say about Tuesday afternoon is a good time for a text. Did your daughter hear anything? They'll appreciate that you cared. It's a good way to send just that quick word of encouragement, like first thing in the morning. Hope you have a good day. I'm thinking about you. Wish we could get back together at church. Whatever it is you want to say, that's where that messaging can come into play, and people can once again enjoy that. Now, I'm going to suggest a few more things that you can do it only if you're able, if it works in the circumstances that you're in. You could offer, for example, can I pick up something for you? I'm headed to the grocery store getting our list. Can I pick up something for you? That's a good way to help people. Now, here's what I reckon you're going to find. Most people are going to say, oh, no, thank you. Because we've already got plenty. And I know you got plenty because when I go to the store, I can't find any toilet paper or anything else. You guys all have it in your houses stored up. And so most of the time, they're going to tell you, no, don't need anything. Thanks anyway. They'll appreciate that you ask. Every so often, you get that one, though, that says, I could actually use something. That's the needy ones you're looking for. I'll give you another idea if you want to try it. You can go online and order a gift that gets sent to someone's house. You know, we think about sending flowers, but I tell you, these days, there's a lot of things on there that you could just simply send, and it's just a nice treat to have somebody think of you and send you something. Try that if you want to try it. I'm going to give you something, though, I think is going to be a biggie, and that is this. I want you to pray for one another. Pray for one another. You need to sit down, pen and pad, and you need to start making a list of names. make a list of people. It's the very people that I imagined you calling. Because if you thought, well, good, I'll just call my family and friends, I call them anyway. No, no, no. I had in mind something broader than that. I had in mind you, for example, imagining who sits around you at church. You usually speak to them every Sunday during meet and greet. I want you now give them a call. And put them on your prayer list. I had in mind the people that you would normally speak to somewhere. Almost every Sunday we meet somewhere in the hallway. You go your way, I go mine as we got our work to do. But I'm going to give you a call now, and I'm going to pray. I have in mind some of the categories in the church we don't ever want to neglect. Our elderly, or maybe in these days, the mothers at home with their kids all day, and you just start making your list of people that you'll call, and then you'll pray for them. And then it would be good to send them a note and just tell them, I prayed for you today. I was thinking about you, and I prayed for you. Hope you have a good day. Now, I know that could be done in such a fashion, it sounds like you're bragging and boasting. No, we're not going to do that. We're doing it in the way that it's a word of encouragement. We want our church family to know that we're still thinking about you. And I still love you, even when we can't be together. Now, that's just a starter list. It's just getting us going. But I want you to use your imagination. Be creative. Let's figure out how we can show love for one another in times like these. Now, I want you to imagine this, though. Imagine if we didn't have our modern technology. Some of you wouldn't know what to do, would you? But you know, for most of history, the people of God didn't have the tools you and I have today. They still had to carry out the mission of the church and the practice of the church, and they had to find ways to do the very things we're trying to figure out today. You know, we're a blessed people. We've got tools that we can use to continue to maintain the fellowship of the body of Christ, to keep that bond of love going. We've got things they didn't have. I hope you're grateful for our blessing. And it's an opportunity we dare not let slip away. The opportunity to reach out with love to our church family. We had the means. Sometimes, though, we forget to do what Christ commanded us to do. I want you to remember this. It's in challenging times like these that we need to be creative. We need to find new ways that we can share love with one another.